Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. I'm flying solo again. Everyone's abandoned me, but it's okay because I have a really fun guest with me today. I have Amy Wilson, who's a historian and researcher who specialises in the history of dress, with a particular interest in pregnancy, clothing, and the body in the 18th century. Hi, Amy.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm
This
really
is exciting.
It is exciting.
We met at our women's thing. We dragged you on. We forced you at gunpoint, history point. I don't know. Forced you in a way to say, come and talk about your subject because it's really fun. So, yeah, we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff today. Exciting stuff for men, more women, but men don't switch off.
This is for you too.
Exactly, there's a lot to learn because we don't tend to talk about some of the, what's the better way of saying this? More unknown, I don't even know how to say this properly, unknown stuff. So, for example, we talk about military history, we talk about the rich, we talk about other aspects of history, but we don't tend to talk about women, what women went through, and women things because they're kind of invisible at this time, weren't they?
Yes, so what we're going to be talking today about is women's experiences of being pregnant. There's information that we already know about the experience of giving birth and experiences of being a mother, but we don't know very much about the experience of being pregnant, carrying a child. And one of the things that I like to do is look at clothing as a way of finding evidence about pregnancy, because, as you say, a lot of this stuff isn't written down, so we can find out via clothing bits and pieces about what it was like to be pregnant and what pregnant women looked like as well in the past.
Well, that's really interesting that you bring up that point because we don't actually think of the process. We think of the birthing, we think of taking care of children, raising children, but we don't actually think of the You've just made me think a lot there because I wouldn't have thought of that process till you've mentioned it, and it's a really interesting process. So, why is it so important to understand these experiences?
It's important for lots of reasons. The birth itself might last a day or 2 days, maybe 3 days if you're unlucky, but the pregnancy is 9 months per child. And we're looking at a time when, in the 18th century, I look at the long 18th century, women had 6 or 7 children on average. So that's 6 or 7 years basically of their lives being pregnant, carrying a baby, their bodies being different, their bodies being a different shape, a different size, a different weight, and all of the different things that come with pregnancy as well. And so I think it's important to draw attention to that because so many women had so many babies, it means that women looked pregnant a lot of the time. So if we imagine your average Jane Austen adaptation on the TV, you've got a group scene, maybe one of those sort of big balls or something, with lots of women in it. A big number of them would be pregnant or maybe have a postpartum body, so they might be lactating or still look a bit pregnant, or their body is still in recovery from having given birth. And that's what women look like a lot of the time. One of my fascinating statistics that I'm really interested in is that we know about Queen Charlotte, the Queen of George III, and she had a lot of children. She was pregnant 16 times at least, that I've been able to find evidence for. And it means that she was pregnant for 35% of her adult life. It is
Jesus.
a huge proportion of her lived experience. It's a lot of her time. It's a lot of her body. And we just don't know very much about that. What's quite curious is in the 18th century, portraits of women were painted when they were pregnant, but the actual pregnant shape of their body was painted out. So we know that Queen Charlotte was painted when she was pregnant, but her body doesn't look pregnant particularly. We know that she was painted with her children. So she was sort of depicted as a mother, and with the future George the Fourth in the painting to show this sort of succession. But she doesn't actually look pregnant in any of her portraits. And so it means that we just don't imagine her as being pregnant. But when we think about the court of George the Third, there is this maternal body at the centre of it. For most of the time, she was pregnant pretty much continuously for 20 years straight. It's astonishing, absolutely astonishing. From 1762 till 1783, she was pregnant.
That's a bloody long time.
It's a bloody long time, and it's also pregnancies one after the other. So there's not really the time for the body to kind of heal from birth number one before she was pregnant with baby number two, and so on.
So there's two things I want to bring up that you've just spoken about that have just piqued my interest. I'm going off topic. I really don't care that I'm going off topic, but one, when you explained like this Jane Austen thing, this scene, you know, where everybody goes and they're at this party, they're at a ball and everybody's there. When you see this on TV, all of these women are slim and beautiful, that nobody shows that they're actually pregnant. And that's really interesting that modern day TV, not modern day TV, but modern day drama doesn't depict that at all. They just completely wipe it out.
That's right. Yeah. It is a misunderstanding of what human women look like. And I think a lot of people like to talk about the historical inaccuracies in costume dramas, and sometimes people get kind of het up about if the heroines got sort of beautiful long flowing locks when most women in the 18th century had their hair tied up most of the time, things like that. But this is also a historical inaccuracy. This is also something that should be, or could be, represented more accurately. Whenever you do see a pregnant body in a period drama, it's usually central to the plot. It's because the show is telling the story of a woman having a baby.
And the other thing I wanted to ask was, so was it on average that women had 7 children?
Yes. 6 to 7 live births. So that's not necessarily the number of pregnancies.
What about the pregnancies? How many do you know roughly on average there would have been in the 18th century?
I don't know. We don't have the data for that. I don't know.
Okay. No, it's just out of curiosity.
No, absolutely. It's fascinating. Yeah, we don't have the data because pregnancies just weren't recorded in the way that they are today. One of the curious things about pregnancy in the past is that you couldn't just sort of pee on a stick and find out straight away that you were pregnant. The process took months of maybe gathering potential symptoms, thinking, oh, I feel a bit weird, my period's a bit late, my boobs feel different maybe, or that sort of, that you're gathering symptoms to sort of decide whether possibly you're pregnant. So it means that if a woman was sexually active, she could potentially be pregnant all the time. You just wouldn't know.
Like Queen Victoria.
There's no real way of knowing until you were really quite far on, like maybe 3 or 4 months in.
Okay, one more question off topic, only because all of these questions are now hitting me literally in the face as we're talking. So
That's good.
here we're going to be talking about being pregnant. We've
Mhm.
also, there's loads of studies being done of people giving birth, blah, 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 blah. What about the question of miscarriage? Is this ever talked about? Is there any evidence for this? And do people say something about it? Is it discussed in any way?
It's not discussed very much. I would say that lost pregnancies is something that, as a society now, today, we're culturally not very well equipped for dealing with and looking after those who've experienced pregnancy loss. In the past, you could miscarry without knowing it, because if it was a very early loss of the pregnancy, you might not know that you'd even had a miscarriage. You could just, your period could be very late and then very heavy, and you wouldn't know. Later term pregnancy loss is recorded a bit more often, particularly for the women that I study, who are very elite, very wealthy, royal women, aristocratic women. When the pregnancy was recorded and then the pregnancy was lost, then there was evidence of that, but still not huge quantities of evidence. There weren't newspaper announcements or anything like that. There are records, but it tends to be private records, letters, medical notes and things like this. Certainly Marie Antoinette experienced a very late term miscarriage, and that's documented. We know about that.
Do we know of any of their experience? Do any of them actually say what they feel, or? And we're winging this at the moment, and I'm really sorry. It's like I said, this has brought out loads of questions in my brain that we should be following, which we'll go back to. I promise this is the last one. Do we have any experiences written, like you said, in letters, diaries, and various different things? Do any of them actually talk about it?
A bit, not a lot. Certainly letters between women who are pregnant, they talk a lot about health. They talk a lot that sort of implies concern and anxiety, because no pregnancy was 100% safe. So there is this culture of, we don't know, let's hope that this works. Lots of references to God and praying and things like this, hoping that it will work out. I've not found anything so far, particularly of women recording heartbreak on this sort of subject.
Okay, let's go back on track now. Apologies for the 1,001,65,000 questions.
Not at all. No, it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's because, like you said, just don't talk about certain aspects, and obviously miscarriage, even now, it's a bit taboo. Women just don't want to talk about it, and they don't, like you said, they don't have the infrastructure to be able to deal with such a loss, and people just don't seem to care. They seem to care more about having a live child, and a one that isn't here is not just as anyway. That is a whole different other issue that we need to talk about. But let's come back to this idea of women being pregnant. You would think that they found out they were pregnant, and what they're going to end up do is they're just going to sit in bed all day and do nothing. Is this the same thing that would have happened in the 18th century?
No, not at all. No. If the woman was well, which I think, looking at the sources that I've seen, most of them were, reasonably fit and healthy for most of their pregnancies. They were out and about and doing all sorts of different things. So the idea of pregnant woman in bed wearing some sort of big white chemise is just not the case in the 18th century. So you would see pregnant women everywhere. The Lady Mary Wortley Montagu was the wife of a British representative who was based in Turkey, and she was travelling around Turkey pregnant and often wearing Turkish inspired clothing, because it was more comfortable and more adaptable. It was easier to wear that style of clothing than more sort of Western European clothing. And we've got lots and lots of records of women socializing, hosting parties, going out and about. Charlotte Guest was pregnant, and very, very, very pregnant, 9 months pregnant, and hosted a party at her house, and it was sort of went on until 2 o'clock in the morning. She writes about not being able to sit down because she was the hostess and all of the guests had sat, nicked all the chairs, and she gave birth 2 weeks later.
Hold on, you've got to put your priorities straight, right? Forget the baby. Instead, let's host a party.
Yeah. I've found loads of brilliant examples of pregnant women attending court, which is just fascinating. I love the idea of all of these pregnant women going to court, spending time with the royal family and in the royal palaces. Really, sometimes really quite heavily pregnant.
You've already just touched on this, especially with the Turkish clothing, how would you say it correctly? My brain is switching into Polish, not outfits, but dress. We've touched on this. What other things can we know about pregnant women through their clothing at this time period?
We can learn loads of things. We can see a lot of things about the practical makeup of the clothes, a lot of a very ingenious and inventive design techniques to make clothing that could be adapted, clothing that was maybe more comfortable, maybe more sort of synthetic to the size and shape of a pregnant body. We also know because of the sorts of clothing that women are recorded wearing, we can tell where they were, what they were doing. This is a time when, particularly for very elite women, you had a specific dress code or a specific outfit that you wore for different activities, being in different places, and you would maybe change clothing 2 or 3 times a day based on what you were up to. So from that we can see again more evidence of where women were going when they were pregnant. What were they doing? They weren't just wearing a shift, which was like a nightgown basically. They were out and going and doing. The idea of a pregnant woman at court, we can see from the records what they were wearing at court while pregnant. It's just absolutely fascinating. And I just love I've got some fabulous examples here actually. I'm going to find an example for you.
Go for it. We love a good example. Give us a nice little description of a good example. Go on.
Yes, absolutely. Love a good example. Oh gosh, this is a very good one. Lady Lavinia Spencer, and she was pregnant with the Honourable William Spencer in 1792, and this is how she described her experience of being at court. Oh, my hips, my feet, my head. Court was fuller than a birthday and lasted an eternity. And she was about 5 to 6 months pregnant, and clearly really uncomfortable. But she's going to go anyway. It's very important for women to be at court. It was a responsibility, it was a duty, but it was also an arena where they could get their voices heard when elite women couldn't go to Parliament and they couldn't further their political and personal initiatives there. They had power at court. They could make connections. They could see their ideas and ideals furthered. There was room for advancement by going to court. So they weren't going to stop doing it just because they were pregnant. And in fact, actually, in some ways, it's even more important that they went to court because their pregnant bodies were evidence that their family was growing and that their marriage was being sort of reproductively successful. They were going to be having heirs and spares and growing their family. grow in their power.
If I'm not mistaken, this time period was also quite prominent for corsets, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Did
Yes.
they wear them? I mean, God, I can't imagine being pregnant and wearing a Please tell me they did not wear corsets at this time. You're going to disappoint me, though, aren't you?
Yes, they did. They did wear
Oh,
corsets.
dear God. Ouch.
Yes, well, not necessarily. I think that corsets sometimes get a bit of a bad rap. So in the 18th century, they wore something called stays, a pair of stays, but that basically was a corset, and that's just the language that they used. By the 1770s, 1780s, they were pretty solid. They were pretty structured, I would say, but not necessarily uncomfortable. They were, particularly for the women that I researched, they had a lot of money. They could afford a pair of stays that was made to measure. Rather bizarrely, it was usually the job of a man to be the stay maker. So I find it fascinating, this idea of a man coming into a lady's sort of private dressing room and somehow measuring her for a pair of stays. It seems unlikely, but that's how it worked. And they weren't necessarily uncomfortable. They were supposed to provide structure. They provided support for the breasts in a very similar way to a bra. And so not wearing your stays was kind of culturally quite similar to not wearing a bra. You wouldn't sort of necessarily go to somewhere formal without your bra on.
Yes.
It was
Sorry, I'm just going to have swinging boobies everywhere. It's fine.
exactly. It was a practical garment because it's holding your body sort of up and in place. There was a fashion element to it. It's certainly, I'm not going to say it wasn't entirely functional. It did provide a cosmetic function of holding the body in a certain way, holding the torso in a shape that was fashionable, which was sort of a conical shape at this point. So this isn't your Victorian corsets that kind of pulled you in the middle and made a tiny waist. The fashion at this point was actually to wear stays that were sort of flat at the front and sort of pushed your boobs in and up rather than like a curvy shape. But there definitely wasn't any of this kind of pulling on laces to squeeze someone in. All of that's just complete nonsense, really, at this point. And the stays were really pretty comfortable. If you talk to historical reenactors, often they will describe wearing stays as like having a very firm hug. It's
Right. Have you
pressure.
ever worn one? Have you ever tried one?
I have. It's pressure, but it's not painful.
So
And
like literally like a firm hug.
exactly. And so when women were pregnant, they wore stays that were adapted for pregnancy. So one of the things that's really important to understand is that women would have been wearing stays or some sort of structured supporting undergarment from being children. So this is something that bodily, culturally, they were very, very used to doing. And it would have felt very odd to not wear a pair of stays while you were pregnant. But they did actually support the maternal body quite well. When you're pregnant, you've got your boobs tend to be bigger, so you need more support, not less. A lot of reinforced support at the lower back, which was pretty important, pretty useful when you're pregnant. And it also sort of supported the bump and the weight of the baby a bit as well. You can buy garments now from maternity shops that do something quite similar to what a maternity corset did, or maternity pair of stays did, of kind of supporting the weight of the bump, supporting the lower back. That sort of thing is still something that you can buy today, and that's so the main way that maternity stays were made were with side laces. So you had your lacing at the front or at the back as typical, and then additional panels of lacing on the sides, and they could be let out to make the circumference of the bottom of the stays wider. So that was the most usual design. I have seen other designs as well, but that style of stays is what you tend to find for pregnancy.
Well, that kind of makes sense at the end of the day, because you don't want to be completely constricted as your bump kind of grows. And it's a bit similar to like getting pregnancy jeans that have a elastic waistband, and as you grow bigger and bigger and bigger, then basically it kind of still supports you in a way. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think culturally we're kind of attuned to seeing corsets and stays as somehow hindering or repressing women. But that's just not the case. The other thing that they did have as well was something called a pair of jumps, which was basically like a waistcoat. The Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, talks about wearing what she describes as a waistcoat, like a man's waistcoat wrapped around her. And so that was also popular and could be worn during pregnancy. It was also quite popular for wearing if you were unwell or doing kind of manual work. You could wear a pair of jumps, and they were sort of quilted like a waistcoat. They could be boned a bit, but maybe not anything like as much as a pair of stays. So they provided some structure and some support, but to a far lesser extent. They were more supple and more sort of bendy, basically, more easy to mold to the body. But they still provided some support, particularly for around the bust area. And so they could be worn during pregnancy. But for very elite women, they would have worn that at home, but they wouldn't have worn a pair of jumps in a formal setting.
I have a question. Obviously, we've been talking about women who are quite proud to show that they're pregnant at court and things like that. But were there any women who tried to hide their pregnancies with their clothing?
Yes, definitely. I think illegitimacy is a big, obvious reason to hide a pregnancy, but not the only reason. Certainly, the Countess of Bessborough, who was called Harriet, she hid a pregnancy. I don't know quite how she did this. It's recorded that she hid a pregnancy so successfully that her husband and her mother didn't know about it. It was an illegitimate pregnancy in 1800. So this is the time when you've got the higher waisted sort of diaphanous kind of flowing sort of dresses, which possibly helped her to hide this pregnancy. But yeah, certainly there is no written record of either her mother or her husband knowing anything about this. I think she achieved it in part by being, just not in the same house as them. And I think it must have been a pretty open secret in some ways, because some of her friends and family knew, certainly her sister knew, and they helped her to hide it. But she managed to prevent this social ostracism or being cut off financially from her husband by hiding her pregnancy. It could be a very dangerous business, potentially hiding a pregnancy. There's a lot of literature, particularly from the beginning of the 18th century, which is about the perils of tight lacing. So if you're trying to hide your pregnant body by lacing yourself into your stays in a tight way, that could be very dangerous. I mean, it would be very, very painful, it would be deeply uncomfortable, but it could potentially cause harm to the baby, and it could cause harm to the mother. And so there are medical documents that kind of advise against that, and almost sort of imply the sort of almost the wickedness of vanity over good health, or vanity over taking your maternal responsibility seriously.
We've touched on this already a little bit, but I'm actually a little bit interested about the fashion trends. As you mentioned, some of the stays were sort of laced at the side, the front and the back, so you kind of sort of expand yourself a little bit. I'm assuming this was a bit of a fashion trend.
It 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 wasn't. It wasn't. I would say that one of the curious features of the 18th century is that the leaders of fashion were the wealthy aristocratic women of the day. So they had this kind of dual responsibility of being having a lot of agency and a lot of power as a fashion leader, but then also having a lot of familial responsibility to produce a lot of male heirs for their family, particularly for the royal family. This was national news for the Queen. This was kind of statecraft, really. This was an example of political capital, and so it means that you've got women who actually led fashion through their pregnancies. The Duchess of Devonshire was very famously a fashion leader. There was tons and tons of information all the time. I think sometimes it's practically daily about where she was and what she was wearing and the ideas that she had about her clothing. So she designed a lot of the clothes that she wore herself. And she was pretty talented. I mean, it's sort of frowned upon and looked at as frivolous or a bit silly, but she was a talented woman, and she used a lot of knowledge and a lot of wit and a lot of very creative ideas in her clothing designs. And when she was pregnant, she didn't stop doing that. She just kept doing it. So quite a lot of the clothing that she wore when she was pregnant was being followed by others. Certainly Marie Antoinette was pregnant when she was painted wearing a robe en chemise, and this very famous portrait kind of spread the fashion for that kind of style. So this was, at the time, it was very controversial because she was wearing a dress that was very different to what the French court gowns looked like, and so it was something very light, very unstructured. The fabric was sort of cotton or muslin, and it was held in place just with a sash around the waist and a drawstring at the neck, and maybe drawstrings at the sleeves. So you can see, when you know that she was pregnant when she was wearing that, you can see how that is a very practical, very functional way of wearing clothing for pregnancy. She's wearing something that is light, it's airy, it's adaptable. And that fashion really took on. So the artist for that portrait, which is Elizabeth Vigée Le Brun, she painted women wearing dresses like that from the 1780-ish onwards. But it was only after 1783, when Marie Antoinette was wearing it in her portrait, that it really took on. And she actually sent an example of this sort of chemise gown to the Duchess of Devonshire, because the pair of them were correspondents. They wrote to each other. I don't know if they ever met. Maybe some of your listeners will be able to comment on that. But she certainly, the Duchess of Devonshire received these chemise gowns from Marie Antoinette. She wore them, and then very soon that style of clothing took on. It was very popular, and probably within 3 or 4 years, this was a very standard style of dress for everybody. And so all women, whether they were pregnant or not, were wearing the sort of chemise gown, and usually with a straw hat and a big sash around the waist, which was very adaptable. It's a very practical way of dressing, and very, very different from the starting point.
So this idea that the Duchess of Devonshire and Marie Antoinette kind of corresponded, we don't know, I mean, like you said, somebody probably out there knows if they've met, which they'll probably make us a comment about that. But the idea that they communicated through letters and dresses and blah, 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 was there sort of, I don't know how to phrase this correctly, but was there sort of like a fashion journalism at this time? Because obviously they communicated through letters. How did this get to the wider audience?
Very good question. The ideas for fashionable clothing spread through a couple of different things. One is that this was the very start of what we would today consider to be fashion journalism. This was the very beginning of printed local and national press describing what women were wearing. It was particularly what women were wearing at court, but it was also what they were wearing in very fashionable public spaces. So this also coincides with a time when very wealthy women were occupying spaces that their social inferiors were there as well. They could see what the Duchess of Devonshire was wearing. They could describe it in their letters, and you see examples of fashion being recorded in diaries and letters in London and then posted to relatives in other parts of the country. So you would get a fashion from Paris into London, and then a fashion from London up to Sheffield or Newcastle or Leeds. And so that's partly how the information about fashion was spreading. And it was also quite heavily recorded, and there was a lot of interest in it. It was not always very positive. There was a lot of criticism as well. And you do get journalistic reports of women's clothing being quite negatively reported, as well as positive reports. But it means, as a fashion historian or historian of dress, it means that there's a lot of information there about what women were wearing. And there was also a lot of opportunities for buying were quite different. So this was the beginning of a consumer kind of society, a society that was able to observe what wealthy people had, the commodities that they had, and then they were able to emulate them in maybe with less expensive materials, or maybe in a simpler way. But there was this commercial culture of being able to buy the sort of replicas of what they'd seen in fashionable spaces, what they'd seen at the theatre or at the opera or at a pleasure garden. They would be able to see what other more wealthy women were wearing, and they could copy it.
Got to say, this whole idea that women were criticised for the fashion they were wearing, God, that's never finished. That's still going on. I mean, like, what, in the 60s, the skirts were too short. In the 70s, I don't know, the tops were too short. What, whatever. Even nowadays, jeans are too tight. Women are wearing, having their boobs more on show, or whatever it is. And it's still going to continue probably till the end of time, that women are always going to be criticised.
I suspect so. I've got a lovely example here. It's in the Art of Dress, 1717. And it says, "Oft I have seen a mantua pinned amiss, make people sneer and almost cause a hiss, for knots ill-fancied or a tawdry gown. Ill-natured critics cry the women down." And it's not much has changed.
It's never going to change, really, at the end of the day. But hey, imagine if they saw what we were wearing today. Heart attack alert. Heart attack alert. So let's talk a little bit about post-pregnancy, because it's quite an interesting thing about fashion and dress. Like you mentioned before, like right at the beginning of our conversation about women post-pregnancy with their bodies and things like that. But were they nursing at this time? Was there some sort of fashion dress style that would allow them to nurse their children when they need to? And if they didn't, what was the alternative?
At the beginning of the 18th century, we do have records of wealthy women breastfeeding their own children. And there are examples which we are pretty sure are examples of early pairs of stays that have been adapted specifically for breastfeeding. They've almost got like breastfeeding flaps kind of added to them or incorporated in them. But it was once the Enlightenment had really taken off, and towards the sort of the latter part of the 18th century, there was this real shift in what it meant to be a mother. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say that motherhood was almost fashionable. It really changed what it meant to be a mother. At the beginning of the 18th century, pregnancy and birth was sort of the end of your maternal responsibilities, whereas by the end of the 18th century, that was the beginning of your maternal responsibilities, and women were expected to be sentimental mothers and interested in raising kind of healthy, natural, strong, well, clean children. So that meant that you got fashionable breastfeeding among elite women. Certainly the Duchess of Devonshire breastfed her own children. And I think that probably encouraged others to do the same. Curious thing about breastfeeding your own children, if you're an aristocrat, is it means that you're less likely to conceive again anytime soon. So it was possible that women were that women were discouraged from breastfeeding their own children so that they could have more children. But by the end of the 18th century, doing your own breastfeeding was becoming quite fashionable, to the point that women were actually painted as portraits of women breastfeeding their own babies. And this is a huge financial investment. This is a time when it was very expensive to have a professional portrait made, and it took a long time. It took months to do. So this is a big investment of time and money to represent, for a woman to be represented nursing her children. And we see it in the clothing as well. There is more practical ways that a woman could breastfeed her children in wearing elite clothing towards the end of the 18th century.
At the end of the day, is there a way that we could compare today with the 18th century and women pregnancy and their bodies?
Lots and lots. There's so much overlap. When you think about some of the icons of today and how their pregnancies have been managed, it's fascinating. Thinking about Rihanna and her pregnancies and her wearing quite sort of revealing clothing, maybe quite sexy clothing. And is it socially acceptable for mothers to be sexy? Is it acceptable for mothers to be doing maybe dangerous jobs, or maybe jobs that are very different culturally from a maternal appearance? Is it socially acceptable to be headlining the Super Bowl while pregnant and wearing, quite revealing clothing? These are some of the things that we still grapple with today. What culturally we expect motherhood and a pregnancy to look like. Do we want pregnant women to dress in a way that is maybe quite responsible or a bit more demure? Right up until the late 1980s, early 1990s, women were wearing these massive big smocks. You think of Princess Diana wearing the most enormous sort of flowing smocks, so that she is pregnant. It's not like she's trying to hide her pregnancy. She's just trying to cover her pregnant body, and so that sort of displaying and concealing at the same time is something that you get in the 20th and 21st century, and we still now have a lot of questions and maybe some double standards in what we think pregnant women should look like and the amount of agency they should have. Is it possible to be in charge and be pregnant? Does it undermine your authority to be pregnant and in charge of something? It's things like this that I feel we're still not getting right, or there's awkwardness there where I think maybe there shouldn't be.
Amy, this has been excellent. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, learning about the pregnancy of other women, especially in the 18th century. It's something that, as we've mentioned, we don't talk about. It's been whitewashed out of TV. You don't see it on, I don't know, Bridgerton, or what is it? Oh, The Duchess was another one, for example, or any of the Jane Austen novels that have been put onto TV. None of it. You just don't see it. So it's been great to be able to talk about this. You've got to come back when you finish writing your book. Tell us, when is this due? When are you supposed to be doing this book?
I think it might be a year or two yet.
That's fine.
But I'm working on it.
That's fine. You will be back. We will get you to talk a little bit more because this has been excellent. I've really enjoyed this. And I am not an 18th century historian, and I've sat here captivated. So you have done a job that many people can't do. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.